In the final desperate months of 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Allied forces were sweeping across the remnants of the Third Reich, uncovering bunkers, files, and faces once hidden in the machinery of Hitler's war. Yet among the ruins of empire, one mystery endured. A set of missing diaries said to have belonged to Heinrich Himmler's personal secretary, a woman whose name never appeared on official records but whose words, if found, could unravel the truth behind the Reich's most secret operations. The story begins in Bavaria, April 1945. American troops from the 45th Infantry Division moved south from Nuremberg toward Munich, liberating camps and confiscating archives as they advanced. Near the tranquil lakes of Tegernsee, they stumbled upon one of Himmler's personal residences, a modest wooden lodge filled with charred documents, abandoned uniforms, and the scent of hurried departure. It was here, investigators later believed, that a young stenographer last served the Reichsführer SS before vanishing without a trace. Himmler's secretaries were known for their discipline and silence. They worked in dim offices within the SS headquarters at Prinz Albrechtstrasse in Berlin, transcribing orders, decrypting messages, and managing personal correspondence. These women held knowledge few others possessed, not just about military operations, but about Himmler's psychological world, his rituals, obsessions, and fears. When the Allied bombings intensified, many of these secretaries were relocated south under orders marked personal protection. Only fragments of their identities remained: initials, personnel numbers, and hints in intercepted letters. As Germany collapsed, Allied intelligence turned its gaze toward these human archives. The British MI5, already deep in Operation Eclipse, the post-war hunt for Nazi officials, dispatched units to southern Germany to secure documents before they could be destroyed or stolen. American counterintelligence corps agents followed closely, sweeping through towns like Mund, Bad Tölz, and Berchtesgaden. In one raid near Schliersee, soldiers recovered a trunk filled with typewritten notes labeled Reichsführer, personal. Yet when examined, many pages had been deliberately torn out, each gap marked by the same meticulous hand. What those missing pages contained became the obsession of multiple agencies. Rumors spread of a woman seen fleeing on a military truck disguised as a Red Cross worker. Locals described her as young, quiet, carrying a leather case wrapped in oilcloth. The case, some claimed, bore the initials HH, or perhaps her own. No record of her arrest, interrogation, or execution exists in Allied or Soviet archives. She had simply vanished into the fog of post-war Europe. Inside captured German offices, Allied document experts found evidence that Himmler maintained a private correspondence file. Separate from SS administrative records, the entries referenced nightly dictations, thought to be his reflections on war policy and ideological vision. One MI5 officer, Major Kenneth Strong, later wrote that the Reichsführer's domestic staff knew more of his fears and failures than any general or minister. If such notes survived, they could expose not only Himmler's political maneuvers, but his attempts to negotiate with the West during the war's final hours. By early May, Himmler himself was dead, captured and then committing suicide in British custody at Lüneburg, but his papers were scattered. Some were burned, others hidden, and a few quietly catalogued in intelligence vaults. Yet the missing memoirs, as investigators dubbed them, remained elusive. The Americans suspected British interference. The British, in turn, accused the Soviets of having seized the material during their advance into Berlin. For the Allies, the stakes were more than historical. Himmler's secretaries might have recorded meetings revealing covert peace feelers, particularly those sent through intermediaries in Sweden and Switzerland. Such documents could prove that the SS had attempted to negotiate surrender terms. Independently of Hitler, a revelation that could have shaken the foundation of the Nuremberg trials. The quiet aftermath of victory. Both nations began combing through refugee camps and displaced persons lists. The CIC interviewed hundreds of German women who had worked in government offices, showing photographs of Himmler's staff and asking about a missing personal stenographer. None could identify her with certainty. One witness described a young woman with pale eyes, seen boarding a train near Innsbruck, clutching a worn brown folder. Another claimed she'd been escorted by two men in British uniforms. None of these leads were verified. What did survive, however, was a coded letter intercepted by British intelligence in mid-1945. Written in careful shorthand, It referenced pages of confession and a promise to hide the truth until the world can bear it. The signature was illegible, but investigators were convinced it belonged to Himmler's final secretary, the keeper of secrets that could expose both the cruelty and compromise that defined the Third Reich's final hours. Today, the first mention of the missing memoirs remains buried within classified war records, but in 1945, they were more than a curiosity. They were evidence of conscience, perhaps written by the only person who truly understood what Himmler feared most, not defeat, but discovery. As Allied soldiers sealed off the Bavarian lodges and carried boxes of confiscated papers back to London and Washington, a single unanswered question lingered in every report. Who was the woman who knew too much? And what did she take with her when she disappeared? Summer 1945. The guns of Europe had fallen silent, but the hunt for the truth had only begun. Across the shattered landscape of post-war Germany, a new kind of operation unfolded, one not fought with bullets, but with interrogations, dossiers, and rumors. For Allied intelligence, the war had ended. The investigation had just begun. The US Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, and Britain's MI5 were under joint orders to secure surviving Nazi personnel and confiscate sensitive archives before they could vanish into the chaos. Operation Eclipse, launched by the Allies, targeted high-ranking SS officials, scientists, and administrators who might hold knowledge valuable to the emerging balance of post-war power. Yet among the millions of refugees and surrendering soldiers, one name kept appearing, a woman who had once worked in Himmler's private circle, and who was now missing. In August 1945, British intelligence received its first lead. A local constable in the Bavarian town of Gmund am Tegernsee reported a young woman staying at a guest house under the false name Anna Vogt. She carried no papers, spoke little, and always wrote in a small leather-bound notebook. When questioned by American troops, she disappeared overnight, leaving behind only a handkerchief embroidered with the initials MH, or perhaps HM, depending on how it was held to the light. MI5's Section 5, responsible for counterintelligence in occupied Germany, classified the report immediately. It was forwarded to London, marked Priority, Himmler Connection. The Americans, particularly the CIC's 970th Detachment operating out of Munich, wanted access to the same file. Cooperation between the Allies was tense. The rivalry between MI5 and the CIC mirrored the growing mistrust that would soon define the Cold War. Each side feared the other might suppress information, or worse, recruit the subject themselves. Intelligence officers began reconstructing the network of Himmler's secretarial staff. Among them was Hedwig Potthast, known to have been Himmler's mistress and mother of his children. Another was a stenographer named Margaret Grete Steinfeld, who vanished after working briefly at the Reich Main Security Office. Yet the missing secretary in question seemed to fit neither identity. Her trail led not to Berlin, but to southern Germany, and potentially beyond. In October 1945, a captured SS adjutant revealed during questioning that Himmler's personal documents were packed into several crates marked medical research files, then moved to an unknown location near the Austrian border as Allied forces advanced. He insisted the transfer was supervised by one of Himmler's trusted office women, a detail that caught investigators' attention. If she had carried the Reichsführer's private notes, she possessed evidence more valuable than any battlefield trophy: the proof of secret meetings, orders to destroy camps, or attempts to broker surrender. Meanwhile, US Army intelligence teams were sweeping through the Tegernsee region under Operation Dustbin, a mission to interrogate captured German officials and scientists. In a requisitioned villa at Bad Wiessee, they uncovered bundles of burned telegrams, including one addressed to Frau H., confidential, destroy after transcription. The content was partially legible. Arrangement with Sweden, potential armistice through neutral intermediary. Such correspondence hinted that, even as Nazi Germany crumbled, Himmler had tried to negotiate with Western allies to save himself and key SS personnel, a fact both embarrassing and politically explosive for post-war leaders. By December, the search for the missing secretary had become entangled with broader intelligence competition. The Soviets, through their NKVD networks, were conducting their own raids across eastern Germany, often seizing the same archives the British and Americans sought. Moscow's agents were particularly interested in Himmler's correspondence. which they believed contained details of contacts with anti-communist factions in Europe. MI5 and CIC reports from late 1945 note increasing frustration, witnesses disappearing, evidence reclassified, and entire shipments of documents redirected en route to London or Washington. In early 1946, a British field officer named Captain Alan Whitaker compiled a report titled The Missing Woman of Tegernsee. He noted that all sightings described her as calm, articulate, and oddly well prepared, as if she'd anticipated the collapse. Witnesses said she spoke fluent English and occasionally used British slang. Whitaker concluded that she might have been an informant planted by German intelligence during the war, or possibly a double agent who defected at its end. His superiors dismissed the theory as speculative, but when a coded message intercepted weeks later referenced the English typist, MI5 quietly reopened the file. By spring 1946, the Americans were closing their occupation archives in Bavaria. The secretary's name, still unknown, appeared one last time in a CIC memo dated March 2, 1946. Possible link to missing Himmler diary fragments. Last reported sighting, Salzburg area. Presumed alive. After that, her trail went cold. Behind closed doors, both intelligence services faced a dilemma. If her memoirs surfaced, they might reveal secret Allied communications with Nazi intermediaries in 1945. A diplomatic scandal in the making. To avoid public fallout, the file was sealed and labelled unresolved, no further action. In official reports, her disappearance was reduced to a footnote. But among the officers who had handled the case, there was unease. A former British archivist would later recall, "She was not hiding from us. She was hiding from what she knew." The hunt for Himmler's missing secretary was over, at least on paper. But in the quiet alleys of post-war Europe, whispers persisted of a woman with a suitcase full of confessions, vanishing just as the victors began rewriting the history of defeat. By late 1946, the war had been over for more than a year, but the intelligence war was only deepening. The world was rebuilding and reorganizing. Operation Paperclip was already transferring German scientists and technicians to the United States, while British intelligence quietly absorbed key figures from the SS medical and research divisions. Files that had once been labeled top secret enemy were now marked asset. But amid this new era of reconstruction, a quiet unease spread within both Allied services. A discovery in Hamburg that hinted the missing secretary and Himmler's shadow were not yet buried. In October of that year, a British customs officer at the port of Hamburg intercepted a shipment of furniture bound for Copenhagen. The cargo seemed ordinary. Wooden crates of office desks, books, and typewriters salvaged from German ministries. But one case was different. It was unmarked, wrapped in tar paper, and secured with a strange wax seal bearing a broken SS insignia. Inside were pages typed on an Erika SS model typewriter, the same variant used exclusively in Himmler's field offices. The top page carried a faint watermark. Private correspondence. Reichsführer Personal. The discovery set off a chain of urgent cables between London, Frankfurt, and Washington. The papers contained detailed entries, not military reports, but what appeared to be diary passages dated between January and April 1945. They mentioned meetings at Castle Hohenleichen, the site of the SS Medical Academy, and Himmler's personal refuge in northern Brandenburg. Among the fragments were references to protocols of the Inner Circle and negotiations with the Western, envoys suggesting that secret talks for surrender had indeed taken place during the war's final weeks. To the intelligence, officers examining the find, this was dynamite. If genuine, the pages revealed that Himmler had not only sought peace behind Hitler's back, but that intermediaries, possibly from Sweden or Switzerland, had delivered messages to British and American diplomats. Such implications could rewrite the moral narrative of victory. And yet, within days of the discovery, the Hamburg case disappeared from official records. When the British War Office later requested to review it, the files were missing. Captain Alan Whitaker, the same MI5 officer who had compiled The Missing Woman of Tegernsee, months earlier, was assigned to trace the origin of the documents. His investigation led him to a former SS doctor, arrested in Lübeck, who claimed to have worked at Hohenleichen during 1944 to 45. The doctor described a secretary always by the Reichsführer's side, tasked with transcribing his personal reflections each night. She never spoke, he told Whittaker, but she saw everything. According to his statement, Himmler's final dictations included not only administrative orders, but a series of personal confessions, written for reasons known only to him. At first, British analysts believed the papers might be forgeries, Soviet disinformation meant to tarnish Allied integrity, but chemical tests on the ink and paper matched authentic SS materials from 1945. A handwritten note on one margin, penned in feminine script, read simply, "He still believes the West will save him." The handwriting did not match any known secretary from Himmler's official staff. Meanwhile, American intelligence, monitoring the British investigation, began compiling its own secret archive under the codename Operation Legacy. Their interest was not moral but practical. If these memoirs contained details of human experiments, underground networks, or medical research, they could aid ongoing recruitment of German scientists. The newly formed CIA, still operating as the Strategic Services Unit, discreetly requested copies. MI5 refused. The Anglo-American alliance, once united in war, was fracturing in secrecy. In one memo dated November 3, 1946, a British archivist described a chilling pattern. Multiple Himmler documents, whether intercepted, seized, or surrendered, seemed to vanish shortly after reaching intelligence hands. "Either we are losing them," he wrote, "or someone is making certain they disappear." Within the same week, Whittaker filed his final note. If the secretary survived, she may still hold originals. The trail points north, then silence. Publicly, the Allies turned their attention to the Nuremberg doctors' trial. Behind closed doors, however, whispers circulated of a second set of diaries, hidden or copied before the fall of Berlin. Some officials suspected they were being held as leverage by surviving SS networks, hoping to bargain for leniency or asylum. Others believed the secretary herself had traded them to Western intelligence, buying her freedom with her master's secrets. In early December, a courier from the British Control Commission was found dead in Bremen, his briefcase missing. He had been carrying a sealed envelope addressed to the Foreign Office, labelled simply HH, Personal Transcripts. The murder was never solved. The following day, London received an unsigned telegram from Lübeck. "If you continue looking, more will die. The truth serves no one." For Whittaker and his colleagues, that was the final warning. The Hamburg papers were quietly archived under provisional, not to be referenced, and the search for Himmler's secretary was officially terminated. But before closing the file, Whittaker added one last line to his report, underlined twice in pencil. "The woman may still be alive. She has what we are all pretending not to want." It was a fitting summary of the uneasy post-war truth, that in victory, the line between justice and secrecy had blurred. Somewhere in the ruins of Germany, a nameless woman carried a story powerful enough to embarrass both sides of the New World. And if the pages from Hamburg were any proof, she had already begun writing history's most inconvenient memoir. By 1947, the formal trials in Nuremberg were drawing to a close, but for the intelligence services of the victorious Allies, another quieter trial was underway, one fought in secrecy, buried within interrogation transcripts and sealed memos. The mystery of Himmler's missing secretary had become more than a curiosity. It was now a question of ownership. Whoever found her, or her notes, could control one of the most sensitive historical truths of the war. That Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS and the final solution, may have tried to betray his own Führer in his final days. The year began with a series of British interrogations at the London District Cage, a converted military facility used to question high-value German detainees. Among them was Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Himmler's personal physician and head of medical operations at Castle Hohenleichen. Under guarded questioning, Gebhardt confirmed that Himmler often dictated private reflections in the evenings, using his stenographers to record what he called spiritual discipline. Gebhardt added, "He trusted one woman above the others. She did not type in Berlin, only in the field. He said she had a soldier's loyalty. When pressed for a name, Gebhardt claimed not to know, but suggested she had been evacuated from Hohenleichen in late April 1945, days before the castle fell to the Red Army. That statement was enough to reignite the investigation. Within weeks, MI5's special section contacted American intelligence in Frankfurt, requesting cooperation in locating potential surviving staff from Hohenlichen. But collaboration quickly gave way to rivalry. The Americans wanted access to the original Hamburg papers, the typewritten fragments thought to have been penned by the same secretary, and the British refused to share. These files, one American officer wrote bitterly, are being guarded as though they contained the crown jewels of guilt. At the same time, Soviet intelligence had begun its own inquiry. NKVD documents recovered years later reveal that Soviet officers questioned several captured SS stenographers, trying to confirm whether any had served as Himmler's personal aide. One name surfaced repeatedly: Elfriede Scholz, a typist from Lübeck who had vanished after the fall of Berlin, but British records listed Scholz as deceased. The contradiction deepened the confusion, perhaps intentionally. Inside British headquarters at Bad Oeynhausen, Captain Alan Whitaker continued his unofficial hunt. His diary, declassified decades later, described the investigation's growing complexity. Too many secretaries, too many aliases, and a war where everyone kept too many secrets. What he uncovered next blurred the boundary between post-war reconstruction and moral compromise. In February 1947, an American CIC informant in Innsbruck reported meeting a woman calling herself Maria Hansen. She had documents proving employment in Himmler's office from 1942 to 1945, and a letter of recommendation signed by SS Obergruppenführer Karl Wolf, Himmler's chief of personal staff. The letter read, "Frau Hansen has served with discretion and loyalty, and her knowledge of correspondence is extensive. She should be protected." Before the CIC could detain her, she vanished. The report was forwarded to London, where Whitaker underlined one line in the margin: knowledge of correspondence. It was the exact phrasing used in the Hamburg diary. Fragments. The search took a darker turn when an American field team investigating a series of stolen document caches discovered evidence of multiple Allied intelligence agencies working at cross purposes. MI5, CIC, and even French SDEC operatives were all pursuing the same woman, but not for the same reasons. Some wanted to confirm the authenticity of Himmler's so-called nightly dictations. Others sought to destroy them. There was an understanding, a former OSS officer later testified, that some truths were too corrosive for the peace that followed. In March, a brief flicker of hope emerged. A British intelligence cable from Vienna reported that a woman matching the secretary's description had crossed into the Soviet zone using forged Red Cross credentials. The same week, the NKVD informed the British Control Commission that they had detained an individual of interest near Dresden, only to retract the claim days later. Whether the woman had been captured, traded, or killed remains unknown. By summer, the investigation was losing momentum. The Nuremberg process was over, Germany was divided, and both Britain and America were redirecting resources toward countering Soviet influence. In one of his final reports, Whitaker lamented, "We are abandoning pursuit not because we lack clues, but because the truth has become inconvenient." The file on Himmler's secretary was marked dormant, no further inquiries. But a few officers refused to let the matter die. In late 1947, a small working group within MI6 began reviewing unaccounted German documents under the codename Operation Lantern. Among the files was a set of microfilms discovered in a requisitioned Munich printing house, rolls labeled Personal HH. The images were barely legible, but a handwritten note at the end bore a chilling line: "The West may forgive, but it will never confess." It was written in the same feminine hand found on the Hamburg papers, and then, as if on cue, the trail went silent once more. Across Europe, the world was rebuilding, drawing lines, signing treaties, preparing for the next conflict that would no longer be fought in trenches, but in shadows. The Allies had won the war, but now they were learning that victory came with its own censorship. As Whitaker wrote in his private journal that December, "The woman's disappearance has become our alibi. If she never existed, neither do her words." He closed the file, not knowing that fragments of those words, Himmler's dictations, her annotations, the faint typewriter ink of a collapsing regime, were already being copied, traded, and hidden in archives far beyond his reach. the question no one dared to ask remained. Who silenced her? The enemy or the victors? By the early 1950s, Europe was a continent of divided loyalties. The Cold War was taking root, and the same nations that once fought side by side were now guarding secrets from each other. The story of Himmler's missing secretary and her rumored memoirs had faded from headlines, but not from the locked rooms of intelligence archives. In London, Washington, and Moscow, fragments of documents continued to surface. Each one added a few more words to an unfinished confession that no one dared to read aloud. In 1951, a historian working for the British Foreign Office was granted limited access to post-war intelligence files while researching Nazi chain-of-command procedures. Buried within an MI6 annex at Hanslope Park, he found a folder labelled HH, Personal, Restricted. Inside were carbon copies of diary entries, each stamped not for publication. They appeared to be transcriptions of Himmler's private notes from February to April 1945, observations on the war, the SS, and the chaos engulfing Germany. But what unsettled the researcher was a final section, written in a distinct lighter typeface, as if added later. The Reichsführer speaks of salvation, but in his eyes there is only exhaustion. He no longer believes in victory. The handwriting beneath the typewritten text, barely legible, read MH. Tegernsee. The initials reignited speculation that the missing secretary, the same woman who vanished near Tegernsee, had either completed or edited the transcripts before fleeing. The discovery was classified immediately, and the researcher quietly reassigned. But the story didn't stay buried for long. A year later, an American intelligence review team working in Frankfurt stumbled upon a parallel set of notes catalogued under the code Project Legacy. These were nearly identical to the British documents, except for one crucial addition: a paragraph describing Himmler's final attempts to arrange surrender terms through intermediaries in Sweden. The paragraph was underlined in red pencil, with a handwritten comment, "Confirm with MI6 before disclosure." It was never disclosed. Across the Atlantic, within the newly formed CIA, analysts were growing impatient with British secrecy. Declassified correspondence from 1952 reveals a memo from director Walter Bedell Smith to Alan Dulles. London still withholds Himmler transcripts. Possible compromise with ex-SS personnel suspected. Dulles, stationed in Bern during the war, knew how delicate the subject was. His own contacts in Switzerland, notably members of the Swedish Red Cross and Swiss intelligence, had facilitated informal surrender feelers from Himmler's circle in early 1945. If those interactions were documented in the secretary's notes, they could expose an inconvenient truth: that even as Allied soldiers were dying in battle, secret diplomatic channels were exploring peace with select Nazis. Meanwhile, in Germany, a new narrative was emerging. West Germany's intelligence service, the BND, began discreetly recruiting former SS officers to build networks against Soviet espionage. Among the names appearing in these new rosters were several who had once worked under Himmler's administrative offices. One of them, a former adjutant named Werner Blaschke, mentioned during an internal debriefing that a female typist had survived the war and was living under a new identity in southern Bavaria. His statement was never followed up officially, but a note in the margin read, "If she lives, she is valuable," possibly controlled by UK. Throughout the 1950s, references to the missing secretary appeared sporadically in intelligence summaries. Always vague, always redacted. In 1953, a memo circulated within MI6 under the header Operation Silence. It summarized an internal decision: all material pertaining to Himmler's personal dictations to remain sealed. Further pursuit of alleged surviving secretary deemed counterproductive to ongoing diplomatic stability. Attached was a short report describing a woman posing as a nurse in a small Bavarian town, matching the age and features of the missing stenographer. The local authorities were instructed not to investigate further. Her existence, if real, was to remain unacknowledged. But not everyone obeyed the silence. A retired British archivist later recalled that a small group of intelligence historians quietly reviewed the sealed transcripts during 1954 to 55. One of them, a young analyst named Margaret Ellis, reportedly found a marginal note in one document that stopped her cold. Next to a passage describing Himmler's faith in British reason, someone had handwritten, in English, "They promised protection, not for him, but for the knowledge. Ellis later remarked that the ink was different from the rest of the file and older. In December 1954, MI6 issued an internal report concluding that portions of the memoirs were authentic, but also contained potentially compromising references to wartime back-channel discussions. The report was locked away, its conclusion never made public. Instead, official narratives shifted toward absolutes: Himmler's suicide, the defeat of the SS, and the total moral clarity of Allied victory. But the archives told a quieter, murkier story, one of negotiation, fear, and selective memory. By the end of the decade, the Cold War had reshaped priorities. What had once been an urgent historical investigation was now an inconvenient secret. British and American intelligence agreed, unofficially, that the woman's identity would remain suppressed. If she was alive, she would never be found through official means. Yet whispers continued. A BBC journalist researching war crimes in 1957 claimed that a retired army interpreter in Munich had met a woman who spoke fluent English, typed on a wartime SS machine, and said she once worked for a man everyone feared but no one understood. The interpreter, when questioned, said she disappeared after their second meeting. The woman had become a ghost in post-war Europe. Not through myth or rumour, but through deliberate omission. The file remained sealed, the words stayed unread, and in the silence of locked vaults and redacted pages, her story, and Himmler's last confessions, waited for history to become brave enough to look again. In 1998, over half a century after the war's end, the British government quietly declassified a series of intelligence files under the standard 50-year rule. Buried among thousands of pages on post-war operations, one slim folder drew the attention of historians. It was labelled Operation Silence, HH Personal Correspondence. Within it lay carbon copies, field memos, and a short final report written in fading blue ink. The opening line read, "Subject located, 1952, material secured, testimony suppressed by joint agreement." For the first time, it appeared that the missing secretary of Heinrich Himmler had, in fact, been found. According to the recovered documents, she had surfaced in 1952 under a new identity in the British occupation zone. Her alias was Maria Holzer, a nurse employed by a civilian hospital near Garmisch-Partenkirchen. She was interrogated once, not by a court or historian, but by intelligence officers. The debrief report, marked "For internal use only," described her as composed, lucid, and cooperative. The officer conducting the interview noted, "She carries no ideological conviction. Her motive was duty, not belief." What she revealed, however, proved too incendiary for public record. Holzer admitted to having typed Himmler's nightly dictations between February and May 1945. She claimed that as the Reich collapsed, Himmler instructed her to prepare a personal chronicle, not for the Reich, but for the conscience of posterity. These were his reflections on leadership, betrayal, and defeat. When Himmler attempted to negotiate surrender through Swedish intermediaries, Holzer was present in the room, taking notes. She later described the scene. He believed the West would understand his purpose, that they would see him as the barrier against Bolshevism. He did not see that his name was already poison. The memoirs she carried, typed, corrected in Himmler's own hand, and annotated with her marginal notes, were smuggled out of Bavaria wrapped in Red Cross papers. British intelligence seized them soon after, but the documents were never made public. Instead, they were classified under Operation Silence, a directive formed to manage sensitive historical material potentially damaging to Allied post-war unity. Her notes were catalogued, copied, and sealed away in the Foreign Office's restricted archives at Hanslope Park, where they remained untouched for decades. Among the files declassified in 1998 was one striking excerpt, a transcript labelled Final Dictation, 8th of April 1945. Himmler's words, typed by Holzer, read, "The world will hate us because it must, but in time it will imitate us, for strength is its own morality." Beneath the typed passage, Holzer's own handwriting appeared, small and restrained. He spoke as if confessing to himself. His eyes were empty, not mad, only lost. The revelations stunned historians. For years, many had dismissed rumors of the missing secretary as Cold War myth. Yet the tone of the documents, their bureaucratic precision, their internal consistency, left little doubt. She had existed, and she had witnessed the unfiltered mind of one of history's darkest architects. Still, many questions remained unanswered. Why had her identity been protected? Why were her statements never introduced as historical evidence during the Nuremberg proceedings? The documents offered a clue. A memorandum from MI6 dated June 1953 confirmed that selected entries from the Holzer transcripts contain material potentially compromising to the Western position regarding late war communications. The note implied that Himmler's secretary had recorded direct references to informal contacts between SS envoys and Western intelligence, contacts that the Allies preferred to forget. For the woman once known as Himmler's secretary, the consequences were permanent. She was relocated under a new identity to the north of England, living out her life in quiet anonymity. She never published, never spoke publicly, and never resurfaced in academic circles. Her death certificate, issued in 1979, listed her occupation simply as translator. No mention of her wartime past. The re-emergence of her story decades later reignited debate across Europe. Was she a mere witness, or a participant in preserving evil? Did she conceal Himmler's words out of fear, or because she believed that silence was the last service she could perform for a man she had once served? One historian remarked that her fate reflected the uneasy truth of post-war Europe. When nations began rewriting history, she was the punctuation mark they erased. Even now, much of her testimony remains redacted. Scholars have seen only fragments, the rest withheld under the vague justification of national security. Yet the fragments themselves are enough to suggest what might still lie buried: an intimate portrait of a man who believed himself both visionary and victim, written by a woman who understood the weight of words more than anyone around him. As the declassified pages close, one final note appears at the end of the file, unsigned and undated. It reads, "She told us everything, but history wasn't ready to listen." And so, the story of Heinrich Himmler's secretary ends not with revelation, but with silence. A silence built not from ignorance, but from choice. In the end, her memoirs did not vanish. They were hidden, protected, and perhaps feared. Because sometimes the most dangerous truths are not the lies we expose, but the confessions we refuse to hear.